All right. I'm so glad to have Returning to Bad Faith podcast, David Wallace-Wells. You know him as a columnist for the New York Times and author of The Uninhabitable Earth. Welcome back, David.
Thanks so much. Good to be here.
All right. Now, I wanted to talk to you when I saw the headline of a recent piece, perhaps your most recent piece in the Times, titled, "How Big of a Climate Betrayal is the Willow Oil Project?" Let's start from the beginning for those who somehow have missed the bombshell betrayal from the Biden administration, the latest one at least. What is the Willow Project? And then maybe you can start to answer the question that is the title of this piece.
It's a project to do some drilling on federal lands in Alaska by ConocoPhillips, which the lease was actually given to them a long time ago, but it hasn't been formally approved. And last week or the week before, the Biden administration signaled that it would be giving the go-ahead and letting that drilling take place. This is, they would say, and it's not untrue, that they got some concessions from ConocoPhillips. They made it a slightly smaller project than it was originally intended to be, but it's also in, obvious direct contradiction and violation to a lot of promises that Biden made, especially on the campaign trail, where he said, in particular about drilling on federal lands, that there would be none of that allowed under his administration.
Question about how you feel about drilling in the Arctic refuge.
Totally opposed to it. Completely, totally
Excellent.
opposed to it. And I think I'm the only one, maybe not the only one running, who's been up in the Arctic Circle. Remember the great oil spill that occurred? And I watched when I went up there, and I went up in a helicopter up on the North Slope and saw what was going on and saw what was happening as the glaciers began to melt, and how the caribou and everyone, there's a lot going on up there. And it's a real gigantic problem. And by the way, no more drilling on federal lands, period. But the Arctic Circle is a disaster to do that, a big disaster in my view.
And so now here we are. It's expected to be an $800 billion project. It's expected to produce oil for probably 30 years from the time that it is first tapped, and that won't be for some time now. So we're talking about a production timeline that extends well beyond when the U.S. says that they're going to be net zero, not producing any more carbon. This project will still, if it goes according to plan, still be producing oil well past that point. And so it's come as a real, slap in the face to particularly people on the climate left. And I would say maybe that hurts especially much because, from my perspective at least, the climate left has been such a good partner to Joe Biden in getting his climate policies, through into law, but also sort of like celebrated. There could have been a much more hostile, fallout from the Inflation Reduction Act. Many of the leading climate figures in America could have been much more critical of it. Almost none of them were. And I think, many of those same people are frustrated and angry that this single project, which on its own is relatively small, but the symbolic value is really, really striking. That having gotten everybody on board to pass the IRA, he's now going to do some other things to make energy centrists and conservatives happy. And, people in the Biden administration are talking about this as a political concession, but it's Alaska. It's like, this is not something that's going to help him in his reelection, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, this is what's so fascinating about it. There is this kind of political pragmatism argument that's being put forward. It's something that Democrats will often hit you with when there's a betrayal like this, that says either this is something that we have to do to win elections, this is something that we have to do because of the composition of the Senate. This is big boy stuff, and everyone just has to put their pull-ups on and deal. And in this instance, it's confusing to me because on one hand, the timing of when there will actually be oil withdrawn from the ground, kind of benefits, as it were, from this drilling project that would do things to help the Biden administration politically, like bring down the cost of oil, is years down the line, potentially long after Biden, definitely long after Biden is gotten through his 2024 election season, and potentially long after he is president in the first place. These are contracts, as you mentioned, that ConocoPhillips have had for a long time now. So that if the issue were, well, Biden inherited this problem, which is kind of the narrative that has been percolating around a little bit, well, he should have known that at the time that he was promising up, down, left, and right during the campaign that there would be no new drilling on federal lands. So that's still a gross misrepresentation. And moreover, to your point, from the beginning of his administration, from the moment Bernie and Elizabeth Warren and whatever other more progressive person one might happen to have been rooting for lost the Democratic primary, the key argument that was used to get progressives in line and to bend the knee and to vote for Joe Biden, even despite their disappointments, was the environment. That there were these pending environmental cut points, emissions cut points that we absolutely had to meet to prevent a degree of global warming and tipping points that would spell a whole new level of disaster. And after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, there was a lot of celebrating about the fact that, hey, it was worth it to vote for Biden because we actually did the thing. And now I'm reading in your article and other places that, in part because of this Willow project, that the consequence will be that the Inflation Reduction Act won't actually reduce domestic oil production by a single barrel.
Yeah, it's actually it's interesting you raised that. I was gonna mention it too. It's a really fascinating dynamic where the IRA, is pouring a lot of money in a lot of different directions. A lot of it is sort of like tech neutral. So, it can be used by fossil fuel companies if they're doing things to reduce their emissions. But much of it will be, incentivize the build out of green infrastructure in the US, in particular, helping with EV infrastructure. And so the demand for oil in the US probably is going to go down. But we're sort of counting on a global future in which that isn't happening everywhere. And we're trying to take business advantage of that opportunity by, over a period of a decade or 2 decades, when American demand for oil is falling, we're not going to be drawing down our oil. We're going to continue producing the same amount of oil and just shipping it abroad in the same way that we're now shipping all this LNG over to Europe. And those people, we get to have those emissions as those countries' problems. This is part of a much bigger story when it comes to climate, which is that we're seeing, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Ukraine invasion and the growing alliance between Russia and China, the possibility of a kind of an emerging second petrostate world in which a lot of countries, especially poorer countries, are doing business with Russia and China, and also Saudi Arabia and several of the Gulf states, as though climate change is not an issue and emissions are not a problem and fossil fuels are the future. And you have an emerging bloc in the US and Europe in particular, in which we're decarbonizing not fast enough, but at relatively rapid speeds. And we're sort of separating ourselves both economically and geopolitically from the rest of the world. And it's interesting on its own level. It's possibly worrisome in many ways. But one of the ways in which it's worrisome is that all of these countries that, by any moral logic, have to develop pretty rapidly and sort of solve their energy poverty issues over the next couple of decades are getting a much more help from countries who are much less invested in the climate crisis than even the U.S. is. And the U.S. is a hypocritical actor here, but they're more interested in climate than Russia is, for instance. So we may see, especially emerging over the next few years, a sort of a new geopolitics in which sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia are doing much more energy business with countries that are not interested in decarbonizing at all. And the US and Europe basically pat themselves on the back for their own domestic achievements, profit to some degree by selling out to those markets, but also don't treat it as their problem at all, which is to say walking away from the global part of the global climate crisis.
Yeah, I mean, you write that you basically can't do this with decarbonization. And part of the kind of narrative fight over what the ultimate effect of the IRA was actually going to be had to do with, I think, a lot of kind of illiteracy publicly about what counts as climate spending, what it actually does, and whether it actually gets at the decarbonization piece of the puzzle. You write that to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the ambitious target established under the Paris Agreement would require getting to zero emissions by 2050, according to most estimates. Limiting to 2 degrees would require doing it by 2070 or 2080. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees would require leaving almost 40% of already developed fossil fuel infrastructure untapped. Limiting warming to 2 degrees would require stranding fewer of those assets, but would probably still mean keeping a significant share of known oil reserves in the ground. And this reminded me of the Kate Aronoff argument that capitalism is just fundamentally incompatible with preventing the worst effects of climate change. And so when you look at those facts, you look at what the Biden administration has promised and what it is doing now, basically with impunity. And moreover, you look at the political tools it's wielding to be able to justify these kind of decisions. I don't know if you saw the Deb Haaland video that some people are referring to as the Deb Haaland hostage video, where the Secretary of Interior, who was championed as the first Native American cabinet member, is standing there offering some platitudes, some justification for why the Biden administration should go ahead and do what it's doing in Alaska.
Hi, everyone. I'm Deb Haaland. President Biden and I believe that the climate crisis is the most urgent issue of our lifetime. That's why we're working to deliver on a clean energy future that our grandchildren deserve. We're making historic investments to restore lands and waters across the country, deploying wind, solar, and transmission projects at unprecedented rates, working to phase out single-use plastics in our national parks and public lands, and through it all, ensuring that equity is our North Star. Today, the Biden administration is making several announcements. First, the president is taking action to limit new oil and gas leasing in important places in the Western Arctic and the Arctic Ocean. Second, the Interior Department will propose a rule that will recommend additional protections for more than 13 million acres in the area. These steps will protect wildlife, including caribou and polar bears, and guard the subsistence rights that are so important to Alaska Native communities. Third is the Willow Project, which is a difficult and complex issue that was inherited. These are existing leases issued by previous administrations as far back as the 90s. As a result, we had limited decision space, but we focused on how to reduce the project's footprint and minimize its impacts to people and to wildlife. What was approved reflects a substantially smaller project than ConocoPhillips originally proposed, a 40% reduction. They are also relinquishing nearly 70,000 acres of their leases, land that will no longer be developed. President Biden has done more than any other in history to invest in our nation's lands, waters, and clean energy. The clean energy transition will not happen overnight, but it will happen with all of us working together. I am confident that we are on the right path, even if it's not always a straight line.
You see a reference made to the Alaskan Congresswoman, who is it? Pelota, the first Native American Congresswoman who has supported this. There's, invocation of the jobs that are going to be created in the state of Alaska, et cetera, same old story, tale as old as time. And it is doubly disappointing, or at least additionally disappointing to me, to see the ways in which identity is being leveraged to paper over what this really means to these broader climate goals, which again were the basis of the justification for asking disaffected Bernie voters to get on board and vote for Biden in the first place.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of a broader story in American domestic politics here where, I think Biden has had, by any objective measure, not ideological measure, but just objective measure, a pretty successful presidency. I think the midterms were a big success for the Democratic Party. And one of the results of that is that the sort of the center left is really feeling like they're riding high. And, they're worried about the reelection, whatever. But especially in fights with the left, they just feel so energized to do some hippie punching, left punching. I've observed this in particular around questions of permitting reform, where there's just this strange tendency among sort of centrist technocratic types to say that NIMBYism is a creation of climate activists, as though, the wind farms off of the Hamptons and Nantucket were killed because somebody was worrying too much about the birds being killed, and not because they didn't want their views ruined. I mean, and just sort of all across the board, there was this tendency before the midterms, all of these analysts led by David Shore were saying, like, the Democrats are marching, it's a suicide march because the activists have taken over the party. Everybody's too extreme. And like, that just didn't happen. The party did pretty well in the midterms. And yet the attitude towards the left continued unchanged. There's still this incredible hostility on climate in particular towards many people who are critical in making this signal achievement, the IRA, which mixed as it is still an achievement, towards many of those people who are really central in making that happen. And I find it really offensive. I also think it's just, as you're saying, kind of illiterate, the way in which many figures in the Biden administration and the sort of broader Biden world and the sort of Democratic center left have talked about the problem of gas prices as though, first of all, it's in any way under the president's control. And second of all, the average voter is going to give Joe Biden any credit for like the tiny fraction of an impact that, say, releasing all of this strategic petroleum reserve has on this commodity, which is a global commodity traded on a global market and with prices defined by many factors, global speculators, but also like the fact of a war going on. And, you know, I think both of those things are undeniably true. Like, Joe Biden's cannot do much about gas prices. And also, like, the average voter is not going to say, well, my gas is expensive, but, you know, I heard that Biden released some more million barrels from the SPR, so I'm going to support him anyway. It's just so much like side of kind of inside Beltway think tank groupthink to believe that these totally empty symbolic gestures are going to score points with someone who feels that the climate left has run away with the like apple cart here. And on the Willow project in particular, I do think it's important to keep in mind, like, at the level of global carbon budgets and even American climate ambitions, not the biggest deal in the world. It's going to amount to something like 0.2% of current American emissions. But the problem is, like, if you apply that to every project that you're considering, if you apply that to every new coal plant or every new, ICE gas-powered car or whatever, you're going to have the same logic. This is a global problem where all the inputs have to be non-carbon for us to get to our goals. And the Biden administration on this point is just, not interested in taking those timelines seriously. And you rushed past them a little bit, but just to like emphasize, 1.5 degrees, which is, the stated goal of the IPCC and indeed the global community. It's also been the rallying cry of the climate left for the last few years. I think it's functionally out of reach, but literally to achieve that goal would mean not just that no new fossil fuel infrastructure would ever have to be built, but that 40% of the capacity of today's existing fossil fuel infrastructure would have to go unused. 40% of what we've already built and are already starting to produce. To stay below 2 degrees it's a smaller fraction. It's something like 15%, but it still means that we can't build a single additional new piece of fossil fuel infrastructure if we really want to be serious about staying below 2 degrees. And I saw a paper that was published a few months ago. I just came across it a few days ago, but that said that just to put a slightly finer point on it, the carbon budget, which is calculated to mean it gives us only a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees, is going to be exhausted at current global emissions levels. They gave a range between the short end of the range was 1.7 years from now, and the long end of the range was 7 years from now. So at the short end of that range, we're talking about completely exhausting the global carbon budget for 1.5 degrees, which is the goal that the entire world has signed up for. We're talking about exhausting that budget by the end of 2024. And so anyone who wants to be taken seriously as a climate leader on the world stage or in the domestic theater cannot be approving new fossil fuel infrastructure. It is completely incompatible with not just what like you or I might want for the climate, but what Joe Biden himself has committed the United States to achieving. And this is just, it's a small step back, but it is an unmistakable step away from those pledges and those promises. And it suggests, as you're saying, that he's just much less serious about pursuing these goals than he's said he was, certainly on the campaign trail, and even these days when he talks about climate at all.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to harp on this point, but I have been reflecting a lot on how central climate was to the argument that was being made by certain vote blue no matter who folks in the lead up to 2020. And this is an argument. I appreciate that there are perfectly reasonable arguments to say that you think that one might think that Trump is a unique threat and all of those things. But what I had put to Noam Chomsky at the time was the idea that, let's say we're all going to commit to voting for Biden in 2020. Let's just pretend for the sake of argument. What about the next round? What about the next Trump? What about the next Trump? And what about the next Republican? And what about the next Republican? What are the long-term consequences of everybody on the broad left, Democrats, liberals, everyone, saying that under any circumstances, we will vote for a Democratic candidate as long as they are incrementally better than the Republican candidate? Does that way of thinking contribute to the rightward shift of the Democratic Party over years? And what mechanism will ever stop that shift if we're not willing to ever, under any circumstances, leverage our votes?
What you're saying, if you think it through, is we should help Trump win because maybe in the long run, that'll affect the Democratic Party. That's a terrible choice. Helping Trump win, as you're proposing, would mean 4 more years of destruction of the environment, getting possibly to tipping points, which would be irreversible, certainly making any effort to deal with it very difficult. It would mean stacking the judiciary with young, ultra-right lawyers, top to bottom, so that nothing would be possibly done for a generation.
And it became clear to me, as it has been clear to many people for a long time, that the nature of our politics is that the Republicans aren't getting any more left-leaning. The nature of our commitment to always voting for Democrats means that Democrats aren't getting any more left-leaning. And that the consequence is that you are simultaneously using climate catastrophe as a cudgel at the same time that you're almost guaranteeing that you'll never elect a candidate that takes it seriously. So I want to ask you just to remind us what exactly is at stake if we don't meet these 1.5 or 2 degree temperature cutoffs that the world, and most importantly for our case, Biden has committed to.
Well, just between those 2 temperature levels, so between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, it's estimated that 150 million additional people would die from the effects of air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels. 150 million additional people.
Wow.
Many parts of the world, you'd have flooding and storm events that used to hit once a century, hitting once a year, sometimes more often. So these are, storm events that like whole civilizations would remember in mythology in previous eras, would be annual or even multi-annual events. You're talking about temperatures so hot in South Asia and the Middle East that routinely during summer, you wouldn't be able to walk around outside. You certainly wouldn't be able to work outside during the middle of the day without risking heat stroke, even if you're relatively young and healthy. And indeed, in a lot of these parts of the world, they're already instituting labor laws that limit or purport to limit labor during the middle of the day because of the health threat of extreme heat. And even in other parts of the world, more temperate parts of the world, where you're likely to see, considerably less high extremes, you're talking about in places like Vermont, routinely having summer temperatures in which young, healthy people experience heat stress or heat stroke on many days of the summer. I had one scientist tell me recently that in about a 2.5 degree world, you wouldn't be able to have dairy farms anywhere in the US because the cows would just die if they're outside. Now that may end up being a little extreme, or we may end up ways of like redesigning our agriculture around that to allow for dairy farming and those kinds of conditions. But we're talking about a total redesign of the world's environmental foundation. And, we are already at today, when we're just 1.2 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial average, we're already today warmer than the planet's ever been in the history of human civilization. So everything that we've ever known as a planet and as a species is the result of climate conditions that we've already left behind. So we're engaged in a quite radical experiment to see how much of what we've always lived with and always expected to see in the future is actually sustainable under these conditions. And what worries me most, given where I was a few years ago, I'm actually a little bit more optimistic about climate and climate outcomes than I was a few years ago. I think the ultimate temperature rise is going to be smaller than I thought it was then. But what that has essentially done is pull the world down from global warming that would have been totally catastrophic for the wealthy countries of the world and made it merely damaging to the wealthy countries of the world, And yet we're still likely to land at a temperature level that will be unbelievably challenging for the global south. And that's probably not a coincidence that is the level of mobilization that we have been able to manage to somewhat spare, quote unquote, ourselves, while subjecting those with the least who've done the least to cause the problem to much, much, much more climate damage than us.
Yeah, I'll never, forget the plaintive pleas from island nations like Tuvalu's leaders, who are completely at the whim of the rest of the world as they face the possibility of their entire country going underwater. You have so many of these climate effects manifesting already, with a third of Pakistan underwater last year. Barely was a blip in the news cycle. I'm still haunted by some of the descriptions of life loss in an uninhabitable Earth, where you talk about just the sheer number of people who die from air pollution. And I've been thinking about this a lot, how focused Republicans have been on East Palestine, and rightly so, and how it seems there is more political appetite to rally behind immediate toxicity, like environmental toxicity. In that case, obviously, from spilled train, a train derailment, as opposed to environmental consequences. But it's made me wonder whether or not there could be more political energy or political force generated behind some of these climate movements if the focus was more on deaths from immediate air pollution and things like that, as opposed to things that focus on global warming, which there's still somehow a degree of pushback about on the right. I was also thinking about this in the context of some community protesters of the Willow Project I saw being interviewed on Democracy Now!, who were talking about the potential negative effects from the drilling itself and the air quality standards, and the fact that the only air quality testing in the area is owned by ConocoPhillips, the same people who are ostensibly going to be doing the pollution.
I want to say personally, I've been trying to fight this project for about 4 years. And on a more personal level, my mother lives in Nuqsat. My family is from Nuqsat. And although I wasn't raised there, I have a deep connection and love for the community. And in 2018, I was invited to go to an air quality monitoring system planning session. And currently, ConocoPhillips owns the only air quality monitoring system in place in Nuqsat. And they also own most of the research that is quoted for the safety of this project to go forward. So we went over the top 10 pollutants that are put out by ConocoPhillips that's required to be put to the EPA, and what the possible impact is from being exposed to those pollutants, like cancer, respiratory illness, and other things, even changing the sex in the womb of a child from male to female. And in that session, there was community members, the youth council, and a lot of us realized that we had seen these occurrences in our family. We had seen increase in cancer, respiratory illnesses. And in 2012, there was a blowout, a Repsol blowout, and that caused one child to be medevaced from the village, another one to have permanent health problems with their respiratory system. And many people have complained recently. There was a gas leak near Nuqsat in the Alpine field, and they didn't evacuate the village. They said that they were fine, but many people self-evacuated because children were complaining of nausea, headaches, and not feeling well. And so currently there is no plan put into place to help evacuate or keep the community of Nuqsat safe. And as I learned more about this project and its impacts, not just to the community and the public health, but the climate impacts were significant. The Arctic is warming at 4 times the rate than the rest of the world. And while many people speculate climate change, we're living it. We're seeing in the Yukon River, they haven't been able to fish for many years, subsistence fishing. We are seeing caribou that are showing signs of starvation. We're seeing fish pop up with mold. And this project is going to accelerate those issues and create food insecurity and many, many issues that is not just going to affect Nuqsat or the 8 communities in the North Slope, but the entire Arctic itself. And then, of course, globally, it's going to affect people for climate change. And so this project, we're concerned about for those reasons, But we also want to transition away from oil and gas, and this would lock us into oil and gas for the next 30 years. And we wouldn't actually see any of the benefits economically for 10 years. So this would be something that, a catastrophe for Biden, who had promised that he would transition us into clean energy. And what is also concerning is that systematically we've seen that small rural places like this, time and time again, coal, gold mining, have had been in an economic hostage situation where they're told that the only way that they can get basic necessities like running water and plumbing and such is to sacrifice their health, their lands, their food security, and so many more consequences from this project.
And how this could potentially be a moment because of the way that Republicans have opened themselves up around East Palestine to make arguments about how we shouldn't be pursuing X, Y, and Z because other working class conservative communities like the one in East Palestine are the ones that are going to be hit as frontline communities around the Willow Project and, of course, elsewhere in the world. I mean, what do you make of that argument? Does that seem like giving up too much to say let's focus less on global warming, and since the harms are already happening now, let's focus on these kind of immediate quality of life and loss of life issues?
I mean, personally, I think of it less as either or and more like yes and, but I do think that there's been a lot of untapped potential in just the pure environmental contamination aspects of these issues, for sure. I mean, I think, when globally, by far the most successful environmental campaigns ever were the campaigns in the US and Europe around clean air and clean water in the 1960s and 1970s. And once people started to see the blue skies again, they saw it kind of turned away. But there was a period when that was really, really mobilizing across partisan lines, across demographic lines. And even back then, the most affected communities were, poor, marginalized Black and brown people. And yet the country as a whole was horrified because it was like you could see it when you looked at the city skyline. And the health effects it's really crazy. I mean, this is research that is, it's a research area that's growing, and almost every week or every month, there's a major new report showing just how few people anywhere in the world are breathing healthy air and just how damaging the effects are. Globally, we're talking about right now something like 10 million people dying each year prematurely from air pollution. And, in the US, globally, we're losing on average 2+ years of life expectancy. In the US, something like 300,000 Americans are dying prematurely every year from air pollution. That's more than died, or about as many as died in 2020 from COVID. That's every year. And the US has enviable air quality. When you look at somewhere like in India, in Delhi, the average resident of Delhi, which is a city of like 20 million people, the average resident of Delhi is having their life cut short by almost 10 years, by over 9 years. And that means that's the average. That means that basically every single person there, it's not just the person has emphysema, the person who has COPD. Every person there is living 10 years shorter than they would without air pollution. And that's basically the most polluted big city in the world. But there are hundreds of cities, especially across Asia and South Asia, that are breathing toxic air. And the WHO standards are such that even when you're in a place like the US or Northern Europe and you think that everything's clean and clear, actually the WHO is like, we haven't yet found a safe level for air pollution. Every time we lower the standard, we find new reasons to worry about it. The thing that's really appealing, I think, on a political mobilization point about this tactic is that it localizes the problem with the people who are in control. So when you talk about global warming, you hear from a lot of folks, who will say, well, okay, so we should cut our emissions, but what are you going to do about China? What are you going to do about India? And that's, precisely the same, logic that you were talking about with on the tragic side of things with the island nations who are like, we can't control this. Our lives are totally dependent on what the giant emitters of the world do. And this is from Americans, it's a totally disingenuous argument because the US is the world's second biggest emitter today. And carbon hangs in the air for centuries, maybe even millennia, which means anything we've ever done to put carbon in the atmosphere, it's still up there doing damage. And that means that you have to tabulate responsibility for climate change, not in the present day, but historically, since coal burned in 19th century in the US is still cooking the planet. And the US is by far the world's largest historical emitter. China will never catch up. China will never catch up on a per capita basis. Like, we are the authors of this tragedy. And that means we have a responsibility to take care of it. On the flip side, or maybe not the flip side, but on, to the point about advocacy and campaigning, any community anywhere in the world can take control of their air quality. It is not something that, there are companies around, they have, power by virtue of their wealth and, their lawyers. But, a single state legislator can make a huge difference to his or her community by taking action on air quality. A single, mayor of a small town can do the same. And small groups of community organizers taking action against local development of fossil fuel infrastructure in particular can really make a difference as well. And in that way, this like public health approach to the climate challenge, quote unquote, like solves one of the problems of climate activism, which is that no matter what you do, no matter how big a bite you take out of the apple, you still feel like you're not doing enough. With air quality and air pollution, the things you can do are available to you locally, and it doesn't take all that much to amass enough power or attention to make changes. And I think for that reason, it's really an unutilized avenue. When you look at the polling, when you ask about clean air and clean water, Republicans are still like, yeah, that's important.
Yeah.
When you ask about climate, they turn away. But when you ask about clean air and clean water, they worry about it.
That has been consistent, and not just the clean air, clean water point, but also, when you were describing the possibility of not being able to have dairy cows in Vermont. I mean, these are basic economic issues. These are people's livelihoods that are at stake. The idea that so often populations are presented with the trade-off of, well, do you want these oil jobs in Alaska or do you want clean air? I mean, the externality that's not being accounted for is the jobs that are lost as a consequence of drilling and additional pollution. People in coastal communities that no longer are able to rely on the same reserves of fish, ocean life, et cetera. People whose farmland is no longer as able to produce food as it once was.
But just to stick on the public health part of it. So the one of the leading scholars of air pollution in the world is this guy Drew Shindell, who's at Duke, and he's testified before Congress to say that the decarbonization of the American energy and transportation sectors would entirely pay for itself just through the public health benefits of cutting out fossil fuels. So we don't have to even worry about jobs. We don't have to worry about the new industries that we're building, which are really quite significant. All we have to do is calculate, is the investment we're making to make this transition, how does that balance against the reduced public health costs of dealing with so much less cancer, so much less COPD, so much less dementia, so much less ADHD, so much less schizophrenia. All of these things are tied to air pollution. And the calculation there is like, you don't have to worry about climate change. You don't have to worry about other economic benefits. All you have to do is look at the public health benefits, and those themselves are larger than the full upfront price tag of a total decarbonization of the American economy.
Well, that's very compelling, David. So my follow-up question is to ask you, what's going on with the climate activists right now? You kind of alluded to the fact that they have been supportive broadly of Joe Biden, trying to give him credit where credit's due over the Inflation Reduction Act. In the eyes of some progressives, giving too much credit the entire time. And now there's been this betrayal. What kind of reactions are we seeing from them? And have you gotten any sense of whether there's going to be a change in strategy as a consequence of this betrayal? Perhaps a change in strategy that leans into some of these kind of rhetorical pivots that we're talking about now, focusing on air pollution, et cetera, as opposed to, or in addition to, I should say, climate change?
I would say that there is like a vibe shift happening without there being yet a concrete strategic turn. But different groups and in different communities and in different countries are moving at different rates and in different ways. So I think, for a while, there were a lot of people who were kind of biting their tongue, who kind of meant the praise that they gave Biden for the IRA, but also were kind of doing it for sort of strategic reasons and are now feeling rebuffed. And I think it's likely that we see much more confrontational action going forward, especially sort of between now and the re-election campaign. But I don't know that there's like a major upswelling of that we're going to see like in the next few weeks of really outraged protests. I think.
I mean, do you really anticipate there being any real pushback in advance of the 2024 election? Because at the end of the day, I mean, have the dynamics changed at all from 2020, where Biden is, the argument is much better than Donald Trump, much better than Ron DeSantis, even if he lies through his teeth the entire campaign season and dramatically undercuts what needs to be done to meet climate goals recommended by the IPCC or whatever other international body. At the end of the day, if those are our options, what is there to do?
Well, I think that there will be some people who feel that way heading into the election, but I do think that we're going to see more protests between now and then.
I mean, can Biden be pushed? What does that look like? We've seen, and I talked to Stephen Donziger recently on the show about this, a real ratcheting up of criminal penalties for climate protesters, including those who engage in kind of property-based civil disobedience, are getting stuck with 9-year jail penalties, the kinds you get in other countries for killing somebody. We see the kind of escalation around Cop City and those kind of protest moments. How do you push a president when there aren't alternative electoral possibilities, where there seems to be no appetite from the Democratic Party in having a real primary that allows for debates with people like Marianne Williamson or whoever else might throw their hat into the ring? And there is a legitimate threat coming down the pike on the other side of the aisle. Is it even possible? Is it a fiction, the idea that Biden can be pushed?
Well, I would say that climate activists played a really important role in making climate the thing that he took a big swing on in the first term. And I don't think that there's much hope for that kind of a big swing in a theoretical second term, just because I don't think the legislative dynamics will allow it, which means I don't think that we're likely to see like a really big, next, IRA 2.0 kind of a project coming forward. And I don't think that there's much that activists will be able to do to get him to try for that, if just based on the makeup of the Senate and the House. But and that what that means is that, actions like this are where he's going to make his mark. So it's on rulemaking, it's on where he's choosing to fight the fossil fuel business over old leases and where he's not. It's a lot of like smaller bore questions of climate protests, that kind of standard setting is where things are really going to shake out. Those are much less consequential in the big picture of like the emissions trajectory of the country, but they matter a lot on many other levels, including moral ones going forward. The question of like whether the climate left is going to mobilize behind him, I think we're likely to see a sort of a less unified rush into 2024. But what I would say on the big picture, even beyond the question of climate activists and their role in the Biden re-election campaign, is I think personally that the Democratic Party and Joe Biden is in a much stronger position here than almost anyone on the left seems to believe. I think Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump are much weaker candidates than we fear. I think that many of the stuff that DeSantis in particular has done around, anti-identity politics, he's gone like, there may be like an anti-woke majority in the country, but he's gone so far in many of those places that he's going to alienate as many people as he's going to bring to his side. He's also, I find, totally not charismatic. I actually do find Donald Trump charismatic, and I think that's a big part of why he was elected. And I think the lesson of the midterms really is like the Republicans got too crazy for the American electorate, so much so that a historically unpopular first-term president with, facing really, really hard economic conditions at the time, not nearly as much achieved as he promised he was going to achieve, being battered like in, from all these directions with no concrete indications that he was going to do well, had like what was historically the best midterm performance of a first-term president in generations outside of George Bush right after, September 11th. Like, I don't think we've really absorbed those lessons sufficiently, which is to say, I don't think the country has really come to terms with the fact that like Joe Biden is kind of the center of American politics. He is the gravitational center. And I don't think that people on the left should be scared nearly as much of DeSantis and Trump as we were in 2020.
What do we do with that? See, if that is true, and I'm really trying to avoid coming out and making a full-blown don't vote for Biden argument at this juncture. But honestly, like the idea, and I agree with you, the idea that Biden is doing very well in polls with matchups against both Trump and I almost just called him DeSanctimonious, which is proof that Trump still got it maybe in the nickname game. Ron DeSantis, and that Trump is doing much better than Ron DeSantis in the polls, but that Biden still beats both of them, is an argument to not feel as compelled to bend the knee and vote blue no matter who to save us from fascism and all of the things that are argued about whatever Republican is coming down the pike, well, most specifically Donald Trump. But I don't know. I have seen this dance too many times before. Whereas I think logically, Joe Biden's electoral strength against these figures is an argument for activists to be more aggressive in their approach to Joe Biden. Too often we see Joe Biden's successes in midterms and in passing some legislation of the first 2 years of his term being wielded as justification for why the left shouldn't make any demands. I heard this from Ro Khanna when he came on the podcast last week, and I asked him, well, Joe Biden hasn't even officially announced his campaign. Why have you and so many other progressives, the Progressive Caucus, et cetera, prematurely endorsed the man? Why not see who else gets into the race? I understand the viability issues around Marianne Williamson's candidacy for sure. But on paper, at very least, she supports all of the same policies that led you to support Bernie Sanders. Why preemptively, prematurely come out in favor of endorsing Joe Biden? And he brings up all of these things about how successful Joe Biden has been, including his climate successes. And so when I hear that, I think, well, gosh, that's nothing more than an argument that, yes, Joe Biden should not be pushed, that Joe Biden can act with impunity, and that basically the left is going to be continued to be neutered until God knows when. Because what is the political lever? What is the activist lever? What is the social lever that could possibly compel someone in Joe Biden's position to want to listen to anybody to his left?
Well, yeah, I mean, Bernie has also basically endorsed him, right? So
Yes.
What I would say is, like, I think the playbook here is the 2020 playbook, which is to say, we're not going to be having an open primary. We're not going to be having tons of like really strong candidates. If there are other candidates, they're likely to be relatively weak. That's almost always the case in this kind of situation. But what happened in 2020 was that, like, the climate left really came out hard against Joe Biden all through the primaries. Some guys gave him an F for whatever. They campaigned against all the other, campaigned for all the other candidates but him. And then when he won the nomination, we're like, okay, let's work together. And I think that the priority set of the first term was shaped in part by both of those things at once. So I'm, I guess, in that sense, a little bit more of a Big Tent lefty than you are, but like I see.
But David, what you just said was, as a consequence of a competitive primary, Biden was forced to, in that context, move to the left. But we're not having that this time around. And in fact, people like, yes, Bernie, Ro Khanna, much of the Progressive Caucus, in their premature statements that they're going to support Joe Biden, are basically ensuring that we don't have a competitive primary that has the possibility of pulling him left.
What I would say is that I don't want to argue with you too much. I think that, that when you have an incumbent president, it's really hard to move them. But I would agree with you also that much of the rhetoric, the anti-left rhetoric that's coming out of Biden world, is really opportunistic. It's irrational. It doesn't reflect the reality of many of these particular issues. And they would probably find some reason to give a stiff arm to the left, no matter what the situation was. But when I look back at, the 2020 cycle, I don't see the open primaries being as consequential as you do. I see the activist pressure that was going on simultaneously and prompted by that primary, but was not about that, as being also significant. And what I mean by that is that Joe Biden didn't unveil a really ambitious climate platform, before Super Tuesday. He did that after he wrapped up the nomination. He did that heading into the summer, heading into the the conventions. Mm-hmm. And that's because he wanted to make sure that this group of people who would spend much of the last 6 or 9 months yelling at him were still going to vote for him. And the people who've been listening to them were going to vote for him too. I mean, he also, I think, had some genuine awakening, whatever, about it. But putting that aside, there was a cold strategic calculation, which wasn't about defeating Bernie or defeating Elizabeth Warren or whoever. He had already beaten them. he was just looking at the makeup of the electorate and thinking he had to do something to shore up this group of voters, which he did. And I think that that is one reason why, when faced with diminishing political capital over the course of his first couple of years, he had basically one. I mean, he did a couple of other things too, but he had like one opportunity to do like a signature legislative act. He cut out everything but climate. He could have cut out everything but childcare. He could have, he made a choice there that I think reflected the pressure of activists leading up to and through the campaign. I think that the leverage is much smaller heading into 2024. I think you're right that the lack of an open primary, the lack of real competition is bad for the climate left here, but I don't think they have no power. And I expect that the course that they will take, not to treat them as a single unified entity, the course that they will take there'll be splits there. There'll be people who are more like, let's stay on ship Biden, good ship Biden. And there are going to be people who are, out in the streets protesting. And, we'll see who wins out. But I think that it's not pointless to try to make him move. What I worry more about is in a legislative environment in which you don't have 50 votes in the Senate, like, are you going to do anything of consequence anyway?
David, I'm going to quote. I'm quoting you back to you. You said, while the IRA has been rightly hailed as the most significant piece of climate legislation the country has ever produced, even some optimistic analyses suggest it might not reduce domestic oil production by even a single barrel over the next decade. You also write that without keeping oil on the ground, without reducing carbon emissions dramatically, we're not going to get anywhere near 1.5 and or 2 degrees, avoiding 2 degrees of warming Celsius. And so again, my issue is that you can always come up with some gain, potentially even very meaningful gains. But what we see too often in our government is that wins are weaponized to insulate bad actors who know very well that they are doing nothing near what they need to do to actually keep people alive and to keep the planet spinning. I know that's not science, but stay with me. If we can have flat earthers, I can pretend that global warming makes the planet slow down or something. But you know what I mean? Like, it's like saying, if I slam my car into a tree at anything faster than 20 miles an hour, I'm going to die. And then having Joe Biden come and want a parade for getting my speed from 80 down to 60. It doesn't matter. It's not, I'm still dead.
Yeah. I mean, I think this points to like the bigger challenge on climate generally, which is, we are racing past we're racing out of the zone of safety. We've already passed through that. We're in a totally different and quite terrifying future. And the laws of climate don't follow the laws of politics, in the sense that, if somebody goes for another decade without health insurance, that's a tragedy. It's a hardship, but it's reversible if you pass new healthcare legislation 10 years down the road. And climate doesn't work like that. Things only get worse the longer we wait and the less that we do. And whether you take that to mean that we need to find opportunities for progress wherever they are, or whether you take that to mean you have to draw some really hard, radical lines in the sand, I think ultimately says more about your sort of political, temperamental inclinations. But the truth is that the challenge is different on climate. The responsibility is different on climate. And while Democratic politicians like Joe Biden, most especially, talk the talk on that, they really have yet to find a way to walk the walk. They like to get up on stage, and it's not just true of the US, it's true all around the world. They like to get up on stage and say 1.5 degrees is an existentially important goal. And then they like to walk off stage and not act like it is at all.
And Grant Lyons is a ConocoPhillips. I mean, the way that we're talking about the Willow Project as an inevitability really bothers me. I mean, your colleague at the New York Times wrote this other piece called "How Biden Got from No More Drilling to Backing a Huge Project in Alaska." This is by Lisa Friedman from about a week ago, and the posture, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that these licenses were granted, and if they were not, there were basically some reliance interest on the part of ConocoPhillips, expectation as to how much they were going to be able to earn from development projects on the land, investments that they've made already, that they've sunk costs into, and that if Biden were to fight allowing them to drill, that they would be subject to a lawsuit that could potentially be in the billions of dollars, because they would be suing for lost anticipated profits and lost investments. Okay. But the way that is framed sometimes presumes that those billions of dollars of government losses and fighting this lawsuit, or having to pay, I guess it's kind of a government taking of sorts, not allowing them to manifest their anticipated profits here, is more costly, again, than millions of deaths from air pollution, loss of the entire dairy industry, and on and on and on, and all these effects.
Well, putting all that aside, it's like the U.S. government spends about $15 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies right now. So if you're talking about something like a $5 billion loss in a potential lawsuit that's going to be adjudicated over the course of a decade, over which time the legal framework around how we understand climate damages is almost certain to move in a direction where we're going to understand these as much more consequential, not much less consequential choices, it starts to make that kind of argument silly. And it really does get back to what I was saying earlier, which is like, we're not talking about, the landscape of 2021, where we're like, the world is, everything is possible. We have to choose how ambitious to be. We actually are almost certain to not have significant legislative action on climate anytime again soon in the US. But that doesn't mean that these things don't matter. It just means that what we're seeing is Joe Biden telling us that they don't matter and asking us to pat him on the back for, creating what is the number, like 10,000 jobs in Alaska? I mean, this is a country of 330 million people. It's just not, that when people cite those job numbers, it's just comical. I'm sure that the constituents of that congressional district are in support of this, or I would guess that they are. But that's why you're the president. You don't have to suck up to, 10,000 people in remote Alaska.
Or do suck up to them by giving them something else. I don't know. How would they feel about free healthcare? I don't know. How would they feel about clean energy jobs? I don't know. How would they feel about any number of other kinds of things, like not having premature deaths in their community as a consequence of the pollution that's going to come from this drilling enterprise. Not having their tourist dollars impacted because you're destroying some of the most beautiful, pristine territory we have in the entire country. I mean, I don't know, man.
You would just like to see that in an environment, especially an environment where you're not haggling over Republican votes and you're not trying to get Joe Biden on your side, that when you were making what were essentially symbolic gestures, not entirely symbolic, but heavily symbolic gestures, you would choose to stand on the side of climate progress and not on the side of the fossil fuel business. Like, on some level, that's like the worst thing about it, is like, it's not even a big deal. In terms of emissions. It's like, what is the, or in terms of jobs. So what is the cost of actually saying, no, we're going to honor this principle here, even if it means fighting a long fight in the courts? That's what it means to be a climate leader.
Yeah, I'll lay my cards bare, and then will come as no surprise that as I've conducted these interviews and as I've watched the justifications that have been brought up to excuse any number of points of inaction from the Biden administration, it has become clear to me that what I believe subjectively the project of the left has to be is to attack this idea that being better than the alternative is enough, especially when we're dealing with issues as exogenous as climate change, where being incrementally better does nothing to prevent us from going off the edge of a literal climate cliff, a figurative climate cliff. And it is, I am very much at a point, and I know how accelerationist it sounds. I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. where it is almost more important to me to draw the contrast between what Joe Biden pretends to be and what he needs to be to save the planet than it is to preserve a status quo that's killing, in your own words, millions of people a year, because it could get even worse. In a world where our current course of action, vote blue no matter who, let's just keep these Democrats who aren't doing enough in office, is going to basically have us settle at the point where we kind of sustain and the global South is plunged into horror, where I'm sure we have escalating fights about what our border policies are as we have increasing numbers of climate refugees. If that's where we're probably going to settle before we actually do anything, when it's okay for us but disastrous for everyone else, it seems to me to be imperative that we trigger some kind of action that prevents that kind of slow decline and forces there to be a righting of the ship before we get to that place. And maybe that's already too impossible, but it seems like there's a built-in backstop already, as you've described it. It's going to be, we're going to stop before it gets too bad for us, but there's going to be terrible consequences for everybody else.
That'll still be pretty bad for us. It just won't be quite as bad as it is for the global
sure.
South.
I mean, absolutely. But we see what the incentives of capitalism, that's capitalism just taking us there. The Republican Democrat in office, capitalism is taking us there. So what's the off ramp?
Well,
and how much? Yeah,
you
go
tell
ahead.
me. I mean, you tell me. Like when you're saying we got to do something, what are you saying we have to do?
I think it is obvious that the exigency of the crisis, as admitted to by even neoliberal Democratic politicians, demands a response that is frankly illegal. It is violative of property rights. If this were a traditional war, I mean, look at the rhetoric that we use around Russia, Ukraine. We say that violating a border justifies spending billions of dollars in military investments, killing any number of people, outright war between two countries. That's violating a border right, a kind of a pseudo property construct. And here we have any number of lives lost, as you've described, all of the economic consequences, entire island nations disappearing underwater, yada, yada, yada. That's the posture. Those are the stakes of this fight. So if the stakes are what people say that they are, at very least, sorry to go all Andreas Malm, but at very least, it demands the kind of sabotage, infrastructure sabotage, that we have started to see, and which has been met with incredible criminal penalties, because I think the state recognizes that that's the logical next step for anybody invested in the future of the country.
So that you're ready to applaud Biden for blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline then?
LOL. I mean, but that's exactly the analogy that I was going to make, though.
Yeah.
We're living in a world where there's like a wink, wink, broad public consensus that it's okay for the U.S. to involve in sabotaging the infrastructure of an ally, which, by the way, had some pretty significant environmental consequences as well, it being the largest methane gas release in the history of methane gas releases, or whatever it was. And that's like an acceptable cost because of a wartime posture in a country that we don't have an official treaty relationship with. But to save our planet, it's considered to be a mortal sin to sabotage a pipeline. It's an interesting contrast. That's all I'm saying.
Or even to choose to not hand ConocoPhillips $800 billion in profits.
Right.
Even putting aside the question of sabotage. Just
sure. This is all hypothetical. Don't come at me, deep state. You know, it is what it is. All right. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to drag you down this potentially libelous traitorous territory with me here. David, I really appreciate you coming to join me to talk about this, and also writing really clarifying articles like these ones. Like I said, your reporting in The Uninhabitable Earth, it haunts me, the statistics and the sheer volume and loss of life. And I think it's so important to keep those things front in mind, because this stuff can become such an abstraction. So thank you again. Can you let the audience know where to find you, your work, and any other projects you might be working on right now?
Yeah, I mean, mainly at the New York Times. I write a newsletter, which is also published as an opinion column in the magazine and on the opinion site. But you could just search my name, David Wallace-Wells, at the New York Times and sign up. And that comes out once a week, sometimes more. Some about climate, some about COVID, some about the future in general. We're trying to sort through all of this stuff. This messy world that we're living in.
Those are some heavy topics. I hope you have a good endorphin management system going. I hope you jog or eat a lot of cake. I don't know, whatever makes you feel good. Right.
Great to see you.
It's great to see you too. Thank you to all of the listeners. I will see you later tonight on Call-In to have a further discussion on all of these issues. Take care of yourselves. And as always, despite the pall that climate episodes sometimes cast, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.